Now, there's a lot of ways that you can go about not thinking about life and its lack of purpose. You can resort, as many do, to irony and cynicism. Or you can resort to altruistic naivete. If I do enough good things, it'll matter. Or you can lie to yourself and you can say that you're great and people will eventually remember you no matter what happens. Those are the ways that most people in our world deal with this issue. But there is a different way. You find a living hope, a transcendent hope. Viktor Frankl, in all of his works, discusses the fact that we cannot actually live life, especially in the hard times, unless we have something that transcends. You get something that gives you not just confidence, but joy in the face of death, because it transcends death. That's what transcendent hope means. Now, those who have resorted to irony and cynicism are already scoffing at me for even uttering those words. Note that in yourself if that's you. And so it is to the rest who will honestly listen that I preach today. This is the message of Easter. Jesus Christ provides that living hope because Jesus Christ proved that he had power over death. That through Jesus Christ, there is resurrection and life. Today, we're going to discover what kind of hope the resurrection brings us. First, the resurrection brings restored life. Now, before you go, well, duh, that's the meaning of resurrection, Matt. I know that. I'm talking about life in all of its facets, not just physical life, but there is more beyond just the physical life that the resurrection brings us. It's not for nothing that we started with this story in Luke 7, and it's not for nothing that that story deals with a widow who has lost her only son. 800 years before that story was written, there was another widow who had an only son. To set the stage, the prophet Elijah has been in conflict with King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and they have promised to kill him if they find him. God has been hiding him in a ravine, and eventually he says, "Get up and go. I want you to go to Zarephath in Sidon." Now, Sidon is enemy territory. Sidon is actually the place where Queen Jezebel comes from. "And there you will find a woman, and you shall live with her in her home." And so Elijah gets up and goes, and he finds her just where God said that he would find her. She's a widow, and she has one son, and she's preparing, at that moment, their very last meal, because it's been a famine in the land for quite some time that was actually started because Elijah prayed for the rain to stop. Elijah tells the woman, "Would you just make me some lunch while you're making that?" The widow says, "This is all I have, but yes, I'll share with you." And God blesses the widow because she was willing to share with an abundance that she couldn't possibly get rid of. In fact, the scripture tells us that she had all the flour and all the oil that she needed until the famine was over. It never ran out. But it's actually the next story, and this is all in 1 Kings chapter 17. It's the next story is the one that we're really after in terms of going back and looking at that. That's just setting the table for us. Some time goes by. We don't know how long he was there, but Elijah had been living there. And the widow's son becomes ill and dies. Pick up in verse 18. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You've come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." Look at that. Look at that anger. Look at how she's devastated as she says that. And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" And then he cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And why am I bringing out these two stories of these two widows and their only sons who passed away? And we have to remember, this is the ancient Near East that we're talking about. There's no social security. There's no safety net at all if things went south for you in that culture, particularly if you were a woman. A woman in that era had no rights. Very, very rarely could a woman even own property. A man couldn't will property to a woman, but he could will his property to his son. And so if she had a son, she had a means of sustenance through being able to care for the son until he was able to make those decisions about how he would care for his mother himself. You see, a widow in those days had no power. A widow whose son died was on her way to utter and absolute poverty, marginalized by the world, pushed to the edges of society, and forgotten. It is a poverty that even the unhoused of society today can't possibly understand. Completely isolated and forgotten. And so you can see the desperation in what the woman says. She's blaming Elijah because she has a need to live vicariously through her son. It's not just, I want to accept all the glory he gets. I need him to live so that I can live. And so she's blaming Elijah for her son's death. You see it there in the verse. If you hadn't come, my son would still live. And of course, that's completely irrational. But you see the desperation in that. Elijah brought blessing into her house, but she's grasping at anything to try to deal with this desperate situation, and she's lashing out. That's the depth of her loss and her despair. Now, I suspect the same kinds of thoughts may have occurred to the widow of Nain as well that we read about at the very beginning in Luke chapter 7. We aren't told the situation of her loss because the narrative picks up with a procession moving to bury her son, a procession moving her into obscurity. Behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. There's a crowd with this woman, but it'll be the last crowd that she ever draws, because they're there to honor her son, not her. Now, she's not as alone as the widow of Zarephath, but that doesn't mean that her situation is any less dire. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Now note in that passage that it does not say that Jesus had compassion on him. He was the one who died. Why is he going to the woman and saying he had compassion on her? Jesus had compassion because it's this woman's life who is completely ripped apart. Not simply because of the loss, but because she will soon be an outsider in every way. And so he has compassion on her. Verse 14, then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. You have no idea in today's culture what a shocking thing that would be. For a rabbi to come and touch the bier, it was not a coffin. His body was exposed to the air. He may have been wrapped, but he was still exposed to the air. So when Jesus touches a dead man's bier, he's making himself unclean. That's why the whole procession stops. He says, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all around the surrounding country. You know, we kind of think that these things must have been really common in the Old Testament days. There's only 9 of these stories, by the way, stories of resurrection. The 3 of them happen in the Old Testament, and the other 6 happen in the New Testament. We've read 3 of them now, 1/3 of all the resurrection stories. But these 2 women are the ones that are linked, I think. For both of these women, the power of the resurrection comes and restores their life, even though they aren't the ones who died. You see, I think it's very instructive to us that the power comes to these women in a backward fashion, restoring life to them. You see, their sons are going to have to die again. But they get their life restored. Resurrection restores life, not just physically. Jesus said when he came, I came that they may have life abundantly. The resurrection power that came into these women's lives was total and comprehensive. They had hope again. It restored the life of their son, sure, but it restored their relationships with their society. It gave them a source of recurring joy. It restored their hope in the future while healing them socially and economically. So these women's stories were about to end in devastation, but God enters right into the middle of these stories and he creates a whole new story.